بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. Today inshallah we are going to start with chapter 3, user authentication. You may remember that in chapter 2 we talked about data authentication or message authentication, in other words, which is verifying the authenticity, the source, the integrity of the data or the message sent. Okay, so the concern there is the data or the message itself. Here we are going to consider the user themselves. So user authentication, one of its definitions is that it is the process of verifying an identity claimed by or for a system entity. So it is, the keywords here is that it is a process of what? Of verifying. So there is a verification needed here. Verification here. Checking something against something else. An identity claimed. So there is a claim here, which is important. By or for a system entity. So I am a user and I would like to access a specific system. I need to claim first that I am Abdul Wahid, for example, and then the system will first verify that yes, true, it is Abdul Wahid, this is Abdul Wahid, and then to check that Abdul Wahid has the authority, the privilege, the permission to access this system, and then it will allow me to access the system. The next step that we mentioned earlier this semester, that the authorization that will come, the access control, we will talk about it in the following chapter. And based on that, we will have the accountability. So if you remember that when we mentioned the triple A's, authentication, authorization, and accountability. Now we are going to talk about the first A, the first step, which is authentication. As you can see that the authentication is very crucial, very important in that it acts as the first defense line, against any breach or any access to the system. So think about it as the border guards. If you break in, then you might make your system vulnerable to attacks. But if you set it properly, appropriately, in a strong and robust way, so you will be safe with high probability. Okay, so it is like the basic for access control, for authorization and user accountability. The authorization, access control, and accountability or auditability they will be based on the outcome, the results of the user authentication. Okay, so we have first to identify the user, I mean, that has to identify. This means he has to present an identifier, an identity. We will see how the user can do that, and then the verification. For example, the identification here can act as the username. Okay, this is my username, Abdulwahid A, for example. Okay, now this is the claim, the ادعاء. So what's the next step? How can I prove that I am Abdulwahid? I submit a verification information that will be checked against by the system to either allow me or not. So usually the decision will be yes or no, basically, or it will be, as we will see in biometrics, for example, it will be as a percentage. If it is accepted, similarity percentage, the user will be admitted or rejected. So the verification is presenting or generating authentication information that corroborate the binding between the entity and the identifier. So this is the generic NIST authentication architectural model, that usually there will be a user that would like to access a specific service. This service will ask the user to authenticate himself or herself, and then the authentication credentials information will be checked based on the stored initial registration credential, which is usually as a database. Then if they are equal, the authentication decision will be yes or vice versa. So there will be like a database at the beginning, which is called registration, or in other words, enrollment. At the beginning, the user will register, will enroll as an account holder or a user privileged to access the system. The username and password, for example, or the username and any other authentication credential will be stored in the main database, and then the user will be asked later if he would like to access the system to present the same authentication credential set at the beginning. Okay, that database, that authentication database can be administered and run by the same organization or the same service provider, or it can be run and administered or managed by a third party, which sometimes it's called authentication service provider, for example, that will do or manage the authentication process for me or for the main service provider. We can divide the means the methods of authentication, of user authentication or identity authentication or user identity authentication into 4 categories, or 3 if we are going to consider these last 2 as one. We will show you now. The first one is something the individual knows, or in other words, in other phrasing, it is called knowledge based. So this one, knowledge based, or something the individual knows, something you know. So it is based on knowing something, based on the memory, the cognitive abilities of the user. So the user, the individual, has to remember a password, a personal identification number, or a cognitive questions, a cognitive questions or answers to a cognitive question that is set in advance. So the password, PIN usually it is just 4 digits or even 6, but it is merely numbers, personal identification number. Password is more complex than the PIN. PIN, for example, we use it for our ATM bank cards. If you are going to withdraw money, for example, the 4 digits that we entered is the PIN, PIN, personal identification number. The password is as the one that we use with our emails, for example, and SIS, and so on. It is usually consists of the numbers, letters, capital, small, maybe symbols, and so on. So it is kind of longer and more complex. The answers to questions, as when you usually set a new account for any of the services, you might be asked to set or select questions that you might be asked to prove your identity, like what's your first car, what's your favorite color, what's your favorite teacher, where you were born, where were you born, for example, and so on. And the answer that you put initially at the registration with the system will be the answers that you have to enter while trying to access or enter a specific or the same system. Okay, so this is one type. As you can see that this type, it relies mainly on the memory of the users. So if the users forget it as usual, so he might be having difficulties accessing the system if he hasn't set a backup process or a reset process to reset the password again. If you have too many accounts, as the average user nowadays have on average 3 accounts, 3 online accounts, that they need to enter passwords like online banking, email, different emails, social media, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, Snapchat, Educate, SIS, Blackboard, etc., etc., etc. And even the devices, for example, you have a password for your smartphone, for your tablet, for your laptop, and so on. Imagine that if you are going to apply the best password practices, that is advising you to set different passwords for each account. So it has to be unique password for each unique account, and each of these passwords has to be very complex, has to be difficult to guess, has to be not related to any of the proper names or of your relatives or of your of any dictionary words. It will be a burden. There will be a memory load or burden to memorize all of these passwords for all of these different accounts. Even though that there are some applications or softwares that manage or store the different passwords, but even though they are like from unreliable sources, or it is as you like collect or put all your eggs in one basket. So it is, if it is broken, if it is hacked, that application that you use to store your password is hacked, so all your passwords will be leaked. So we have to consider this carefully. In order to, other than other disadvantages of passwords, like some people may work around it by writing it down, or writing it in a file or a notepad and store it as plain text, or writing it down in sticky notes and post it on their desks or monitors, or they share it with others in order to use. All of these are disadvantages, even though that passwords in general is still the most common authentication method. Another way to overcome the shortcomings that we mentioned or we listed about the knowledge-based user authentication is the token-based authentication, or something the individual poses, or something the individual has, something you have. So you have to have something, to carry something with you. So it can be a smart card, like the bank card that we are using as a token. It can be electronic key card, it can be physical key, it can be additional device, it can be a smartphone. So we have to carry something. This has solved some of the shortcomings of the password, as you don't need to remember things here usually or basically. So you are not going to forget it, but it introduces another shortcoming or other disadvantages. So some of them that the user has the burden to carry things with additional devices or additional tokens with them. Imagine that you have to use different tokens for your different accounts. So how many cards or how many token devices that you need to carry with you as a user. This token can be lost as well, and still it can be shared. Like the password, I can give the token to my colleague to access my office or to access my account and so on. That's why it is usually the tokens usually are not used separately alone. Usually it comes with another method, like with the knowledge based, that will become two-factor authentication. So each of these methods is considered factor. So if we use more than one, so it will be two-factor or multi-factor authentication. Like in our daily use, if we use two-factor authentication if we are going to withdraw money. So we need to have our bank card to insert it into the ATM machine. And so I am claiming that I am Abdul Wahid and I am a customer of this bank. But how can I prove that claim? I have to enter the PIN card. Okay, so this is one example of the two-factor authentication that we use every day. So in order to overcome both of these disadvantages or shortcomings that come with knowledge-based authentication and token-based authentication, biometrics were introduced. Biometrics, from its name, it can be considered as one biometrics, or it can be divided into static and dynamic, or physical and behavioral. It is from its name, bio, that it is related to human body biology, and metrics like measures or measurements. So it's سمات حيوية or قياسات حيوية. It can be static, that is not changed over time, like fingerprint, retina scan, iris scan, facial recognition. Okay, or it can be dynamic or behavioral. Dynamic, that it can be changed over time or based on specific conditions, like voice pattern, handwriting, typing rhythm, gait, Gait, for like walking pattern. These, even though that they are distinct for individuals, but they are not like they are not very accurate, like fingerprint, retina, iris, or face, as they are changing over time, or based like on healthy issues, on mood. If I am in a good mood, I may speak slowly. If I am excited, I can speak loudly or quickly. My walking, for example, if I am sick, my walking will be very slow. If I am very well, healthy sounds, so I will walk with high pace and quickly, so on. So this is, as you can see, these are more related to the user, the human himself. So the user here doesn't need to remember things like in individual knows, like knowledge base. The user here in biometrics doesn't need even to carry additional devices or tokens. So he himself, he need to be there just to authenticate himself. So there is no need for usually for additional devices. There is no probability for sharing this. I cannot give my fingerprint to someone else to use the system, so it is more secure. However, sometimes in some of these methods the user the user needs to have additional device to use it, like a retina scan, for example, which is for the back end scan of the back end of the eye, but not all of them. Usually with the new emerging technologies, the smartphones, these biometrics can be deployed easily. As now, for example, you may be able to use your fingerprint or facial recognition with your smartphones easily without having any additional devices. Okay, if we would like to secure systems that are critical or sensitive, so we have to use a number of these three. So we can consider biometrics as once or two. So we can use multi-factor. We can use password, token as mobile, for example, and voice or fingerprint also, if it is for military location, for example, and so on. Okay. Another difference between biometrics, the use of biometrics or the outcomes of biometrics and token and password, is that the result of authentication process here with the token and the knowledge base is 0 or 1, true or false. Either yes, this is exactly the same password or the same answer, or yes, this is exactly the same token or the same number generated by the token, or no, it is not. But here with the biometrics, as its nature is not very stable, so even with fingerprint or facial or retina, the similarity between my fingerprint now might be slightly just different than my fingerprint yesterday or last month or last year. So the results here will not be exactly or directly true or false, yes or no, but it will be like a percentage. Like it is 95% that this fingerprint is the same as stored into the database. Okay, so it depends on something called threshold. Threshold. If the threshold is reached, so it is acceptable. If not, no, it will be rejected. Threshold means that the system administrator will set a minimum similarity percentage for the biometrics to be similar to what is stored on the database in order to either approve or not. For example, if I am using the mobile, my smartphone, there is a need to consider the usability, user convenience. Do you remember that we need to trade off to balance between usability and security? The user will be not satisfied if he has been rejected many times. If he's being rejected many times, he's trying to put his fingerprint, reject, and then sometimes after 3 rejections, the device will be locked for 1 or 2 or 3 minutes. Then he can, or he will be allowed to try to submit his fingerprint again. This will be annoying to the users and probably may lead the user to disable this feature. Not, he doesn't want to use it anymore. So there has to be a balance. If the device or the system or the account that we are going to set a biometric for it, biometric authentication for it, so if he doesn't have very high critical or sensitive data, so it is okay, for example, to have the similarity, let's say 60%. Okay, so if the similarity is 60% and above, the system, the authentication system or the authentication process outcome will be accepted. If it is below that, it will be rejected. But this threshold is considered relatively low for critical systems or critical locations like banking, for example, or military and so on. So we have to set it as high as possible, but without locking down the user. That will not allow it to enter completely. As you can see here, that our decision, the decision that we said here, that we need to apply only knowledge-based or knowledge-based with token-based, or only biometrics or biometrics and tokens, or all the three together, will depend on the risk assessment for user authentication. We need to consider or to assess the assurance level needed, for a specific system, how secure will or do we need it, then the potential impact if it is hacked, what will be the consequences on us, as individuals or organizations, and then the areas of risk. Let's briefly talk about each one of them. The assurance level here describes an organization's degree of certainty that a user has presented a credential that refers to his or her identity. So it is the level of certainty or the degree of certainty or of confidence needed. How confident I want to be about the authenticity of the user in order to allow him to use it or not. We can divide them to 4 levels. Level 1, there is little or no confidence needed. Some confidence. Level 2, high confidence, and very high confidence needed. The potential impact. This concept is closely related to that of assurance level. So usually if it is the opposite. If it is proportionate, if the assurance level needed is very high, so the potential for that, the potential impact of that hack, of that resource will be high. So based on the standards for security categorization of federal information and information systems, they define three levels of potential impact on organizations or individuals should there be a breach of security, if there is a breach of security. Okay, like the breach here is failure in user authentication. If Ali, for example, someone called Ali has tried to access a system that Abdul Wahid is authorized to access it, and he has been accepted. So it is a failure of authentication. Okay? It can be low impact, moderate, or high. And try to use your common sense to differentiate between them based on the effect, the adverse effect. Low with limited or no or limited effect on organizations' operations or assets or individuals. Moderate, there is a serious adverse effect. High, there is a catastrophic, very severe, high severe adverse effect. So we can have like a matrix in order to decide what authentication to use. We can have the assurance level here with the potential of the impact, and we can categorize them. See that if it is inconvenience, if it is, for example, very high rejections of the genuine user, financial loss, high level, and the impact is high as well, and so on. We talked about each one of these on that slide that had all the four methods. We mentioned that password is still the most widely used, the most common used, even though or despite the shortcomings of it. There are some So we said that the system compares the password with the one stored for that specified login. The user ID is considered as the claim that this is the authorized party, and after that, after a successful authentication, it will determine the user privileges, permissions. There are some vulnerabilities for passwords, as you can imagine, the offline dictionary attack. And just to mention some of them, that the attacker will try to use all the dictionary vocabularies of words. If the user has set it in a weak way that is from the dictionary, so it will be easily guessed. I have a password guessing against a single user, so as much information as possible will be collected about a single specific target or user, and they will try to use the information about him to guess the password. Workstation hijacking, taking over a specific device, computer or mobile, exploiting multiple password use. If the same password is used for like a non-critical system and another critical system, so if that non-critical system is hacked, so the same password will be used with the critical ones. Exploiting user mistakes like writing down the passwords or reading it out loud, or saving the password in a browser of a shared computer and so on. Popular password attack, for example, it is unfortunately still, with surveys that are conducted every year, still, believe it or not, the most used password is still 12345 6, or 12345, or quad 3, like the left high row of the keyboard, QWERTY, and so on. Some users are setting these just for convenience, neglecting the protection needed. These are some of the protection methods that are used to secure the passwords. The password can be used with something called salting, that is adding like a hash with the password itself before sending it to the server to compare. So this sorting will prevent duplications of the passwords, and it prevents the password from being visible, being seen by even the administrators. It increases the difficulty of offline dictionary attacks. Okay, limiting even the number of failed attempts will help by adding a layer of protection, but on the other hand, it will be sometimes inconvenient for the user to for the genuine user to accept that. This is very specific to Unix, so you don't need to be very specific to an operating system. These are some of the password cracking or attacks. We have dictionary attacks, rainbow table attacks, password crackers, and John and Ripper. Dictionary attack, from its title, it is a very known one that is using the dictionary words to attack or to use as possible passwords. Okay, the other one is rainbow table. It is a pre-computed table that they can use to do that attack. John and Ripple is an open source password Usually it is mainly developed to crack passwords. It uses a combination of brute force and dictionary techniques. Remember, brute force is using all possible passwords for that. So again, as we mentioned in the last chapter, that the shorter password lengths, the easier to track. So the modern approaches or best practices, they call the complex password policy that we mentioned or we have seen in many places. The main goal of them is to make it very long to crack. It cannot prevent password cracking completely, but it make it very complex, so it may need the attacker longer time till maybe he will despair, will give up. So see that the number of guesses needed for a password depends on the percent guessed. Here we can have a password file access control, but as we said that it is vulnerable for having it being cracked and all passwords to be leaked. So if we cannot use other methods for authentication, we are encouraged to educate our users, our staff, how to create passwords, strong passwords. We can have computer generated passwords and make it enforced to users. We can have reactive password checking if the user has set a password, so the computer will see it or will check it against like a preset or dictionary passwords and inform the user that this password is weak or medium or strong and so on. Proactive password checking, this is what we have just mentioned. Bloom filter is one of them, used to build a table based on dictionary using hashes. Check desired password against this table. If it is almost unique or it is not repeated or not mentioned in that filter, so it will be accepted to be set as a password by me. Okay, so this is all about passwords.